run those supplements through them, they end up in the sewage. Crunchies, like crackers. Studies on European postmenopausal women showed that MK7 from NATO Vegan Deficiency Series, Part 5, Vitamin K2. We have already discussed coenzyme Q10, cholesterol, and vitamin D in the previous series. And vitamin K2 will kind of complete the circle of nutrients that share similar biological roles inside of the human body. So let's discuss it today. Vitamin K, when we hear about it, usually pop articles refer to vitamin K1, phyloquinone, because it's the vitamin that's predominantly found in plant or in foods of plant origin. And if we take food pyramid as the exemplar diet for humans, then we will of course see the dominant role of vitamin K1 in human nutrition. However, it's not a usable form for human body, not as usable as K2 vitamins, and actually there is a strong degree of conversion of vitamin K1 that happens in a lot of human tissues. Regardless of this conversion, though, the preformed vitamin K2 plays a much bigger and much more profound role in the human body, and we are to explore this in this video. Vitamin K comes in two forms that we mostly hear about, but there's also some transitional form K3. We're not going to touch up on that today. K1 is phyloquinone, is the vitamin of plant origin, found mainly in leafy greens in different plants, and actually participates in photosynthesis. Vitamin K2 refers, the umbrella term, the umbrella title K2 covers the class of vitamins called menaquinones. These are organic long linear molecules that, depending on the number of isoprenoid side chain residues, will get this number. So typically we'll hear about MK4 and MK7. And today we actually will focus on those two forms of menaquinones. I will be calling them MK4, MK7. They are of most significance for the human body, and they're the most studied forms of vitamin K2. So this is what we're going to discuss today. Vitamin K1, plant origin, its conversion into the forms of MK4, because K1 can get converted into MK4 in the mammal tissues, and also MK7, that is the form of K2 that is of bacterial origin. So when we think about MK4, this vitamin, since it's synthesized in the animal tissues, we will find it in meat, in poultry, in organ meats, we will find it in butter, and we'll find it in the egg yolks. MK7 in turn, being a bacterial origin vitamin, we will find it in cheeses, we will find it in the renowned natto beans, and we will find it in sauerkraut, of course in some trace amounts. So phyloquinone, or K1, is involved in photosynthesis process and is abundant in green leaves. On a raw vegan diet, you can score above 1000% of RDV of K1 if you eat salads. However, like as with all plant matter, we run into the bioavailability and usability roadblocks with this vitamin. Herbivorous animals, they can get large amounts of K1 through consumption of their natural foods, such as grasses. Thus, they will accumulate and convert K1 into K2, and we can obtain preformed K2 from the animal tissues. Animals that are destined to eat non-species appropriate foods, when they're on some artificially designed feed, they will have to supplement with K2. They actually receive some K2 derivatives to prevent the risk of fractures. So farm animals that are not receiving adequate nutrition, such as grass, the species-appropriate nutrition, they are supplemented with some derivative of K2 to prevent the fractures. Performing literature search on the subject of K2 was quite challenging because the authors, even the authors of some peer-reviewed studies, they often mix up K1 and K2 to referring to those vitamins either interchangeably or just using vitamin K as a whole. Like that's, if you open Chronometer, if you open a nutrition tracker, most items will have the value of vitamin K1 or K2 just listed as K. And K2 data even is not available for most foods on most nutritional trackers. Because of that, I had to actually go more in depth to find relevant information distinguishing K1 and K2, because it was really difficult to, for example, see some review papers that would discuss some role of vitamin K2 and then jumping on some traits that are inherent for vitamin K1. I just got tired of that, and I decided, as always, to study the mechanisms. If you look at my table, you can see that I classified vitamin K2 as unreliably available on a vegan diet and as essential. I will explain why I did that. The renowned natto beans, they exist. They contain large amount of vitamin K2, largely in MK7 form. However, speaking of unreliable availability, I have never met a person in real life that would regularly, or even at least occasionally, consume natto beans. It is an exotic supplement, and moreover, we will discuss something interesting about the natto beans further in this talk, because there were some studies that might be quite eye-opening with respect to natto beans. But when we think about the other vegan sources of vitamin K2, it's sauerkraut. But one would need to eat over 10 cups of sauerkraut per day to get any adequate dose of K2, any appreciable dose of K2 that would do anything. Which means that there is no vegan source of K2 that would be plausible for daily consumption of an average individual. Then, on the essential factor, I consider it to be essential for two reasons. There was a previous assumption on vitamin K2 bacterial synthesis inside of the intestine. What's wrong with that? Turns out that previous assumption that up to 50% of all K2 needed for the body was synthesized by the intestinal bacteria turned out to be wrong, because there was some let's say technical limitation in how properly you can assess the vitamin contents. So later, this contribution of bacterial synthesis was reevaluated and got this upper limit of 10%. At the same time, we cannot fully diminish the role of intestinal synthesis of K2, despite the fact that yes, it's produced in the colon where there are no bile acids, and vitamin K2 is fat-soluble vitamin, so it requires to be emulsified, it requires carrier molecules to be absorbed. Absorption typically happens in the intestine, but it's produced in the colon by the bacteria. Then second impediment to this process is that this vitamin K2 is locked inside of the bacterial cell membrane, so it also reduces its accessibility for the body. Despite that, what was shown is that antibiotic therapies, they may cause K2 deficiency, which further supports the contribution of some intestinal synthesis of K2. And of course, raw vegans will tell you that if you work hard for 10 years, if you overcome 10 years of bloating, distension, diarrhea, and stuff like that, you will, sometime down the road in 20 years, you will build proper microbiome to be capable of synthesizing anything you want, B12, amino acids, everything. You will be able to be a breatharian, whoever not. However, we have some anatomical limitations that won't allow this to happen, so don't get fooled by that. At the same time, the second thing is conversion of K1 into K2. It does occur. Conversion of K1 into K2 does occur in the animal tissues. However, it is considered to be, for one, a highly inefficient process because K1 is not a bioavailable vitamin, because K1 is locked inside of the insoluble plant cells, plant matrix. Only like up to 10% of all K1 locked in the plants is accessible for, like whole food sources, is accessible for the body, maybe perhaps. And then conversion rate is also varies from like 5 to 25%. But what's important is that it does not, regardless of whether it converts or not, it doesn't have this converted K1 does not contribute into actions that are inherent for K2. And we will also look into the studies that discuss that. So basically, yes, your body, specific tissues, notably specific tissues, can convert K1 into K2. Brain being one of the most efficient converters. And also endocrine glands and salivary glands, they all tend to convert phyloquinons into K2 in the MK4 form. We technically could put K2 in the conditionally essential column, but I decided to keep it essential because, again, none of the routes of receiving K2 through either intestinal synthesis or through conversion of K1 into K2 were shown to have biological action. Of course, not much is known about K2, but with certain comorbidities that K2 helps to reverse, consumption of preformed K2 was shown to be the only effective measure, as opposed to consumption of high doses of K1, for example. Now let's discuss some interesting properties and forms of K2 supplements. As I mentioned, K vitamins are linear organic molecules that can exist in forms of isomers. As you know, molecules can have, they can switch positions of different atoms or groups depending on the conditions, and typically this process happens either due to some physical impact, such as supplying energy, or through some chemical impact when some atoms, it also works through energy, so you make the switch to be a more energetically favorable process than to keep the atoms where they are. So this switching between the isomers can happen with menaquinone molecules as well, altering the structure of vitamin K2. The study that I found was looking specifically at MK7. This is one of the most frequently administered supplemental form of K2, MK7. What they found was that isomers actually have much less, almost no bioactivity compared to the active isomer of this molecule. They refer to as transenses. Why is it important when we think about the supplemental form of K2? They found that MK7 molecules are highly sensitive to radiation, specifically to UV light. Then they also studied the thermal impact on properties of MK7 molecules. They found it to be moderately heat sensitive, so if we think about, for example, contents of K2 in foods, we should not be too concerned because normal thermal treatment that we use for food is unlikely to influence the structure of K2. But the third very important factor was oxidation. And this is the thing that we need to think about when we consider supplemental K2. We need to be very mindful where we're sourcing those vitamins, because you can get a completely empty product and get no benefits, so to speak. Consumption of natural, wholesome sources of K2, just like with pretty much any nutrient, is of course preferred, because if you look into the instability of different mineral supplements, different organic molecules like vitamins, vitamin protein complexes, you will likely see that most of them are unstable, and K2 is no exception. I don't know how to trace that. I don't know if manufacturers study the properties of their powders prior to packaging. I don't know how to ensure the proper storage of those supplements before they get to you. So this is something you need to be aware of. It's, again, another advertisement of natural sources of all nutrients. The main motto of nutritional science is to strive to get all nutrition naturally through foods. While we are on the supplement concerns, we need to discuss supplement safety. In general, if we look at Japan, they are leading in terms of extreme K2 supplementation experiments on their people, because it's known that they consume natto beans, so they have the habit of consuming large doses of K2. So they also employed studies with supplemental K2, and they found that doses of up to 90 milligrams of K2 in the MK4 form per day did not result in any toxicity or adversity. Similarly, European committees also do not have any advisories against supplementation with K2 in terms of, again, possible side effects and toxicity. So far, there is no established toxicity of K2 supplements, including large doses of supplemental K2. So this is something that we know so far. Now let's discuss the biological significance of K2. The main function of all types of vitamin K is to activate proteins that serve important roles in blood clotting, if we think about K1, in heart and bone health. This is more in the realm of K2 responsibilities. It participates in activating 19 different proteins, and 12 of those are not related to coagulation. We all know that K1 helps in blood coagulation. The roles of K2 are different and probably are much more profound, but unfortunately not studied as well as K1. And so here are some of the possible and likely and somewhat proven and researched roles and benefits of consuming K2. First, K2 helps to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease mortality by preventing calcium deposition in the blood vessels, and helps to prevent and reverse arterial calcification, which is one of the most important risk factors of cardiovascular disease and mortality as well. Second, it helps to allocate calcium in the bones where it belongs, thus possibly providing protection against osteoporosis, given that other complementary factors are taken into account simultaneously. Of course, for bone health, we need protein, we need bioavailable protein, we need vitamin D, we need calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, we need a lot of minerals to be present. And of course, we need all factors for collagen formation, and we need to reduce the factors that can cause premature collagen destruction. 3. Likewise, it helps to protect the teeth. Our dental health may also depend on K2. Number 4, K2 may protect against cancer. Vitamin K2 thus, and also vitamin K3 are considered to be a possible candidates for further research on cancer and cancer management and reversal. Then, the EPIC Heidelberg study did not find any relationship between vitamin K1 and cancer incidence or mortality, but it did document that vitamin K2 decreased mortality due to cancer. This finding was likely driven by the effect of vitamin K2 on lung cancer. Vitamin K2 also decreased the risk of developing lung and prostate cancer, but had no effect on colorectal or breast cancer. The existing literature has some data on the anti-cancer effects of vitamin K. Most data relate to synthetic vitamin K3, which on a molecular basis is apparently a much more active anti-cancer drug than either vitamin K1 or vitamin K2. Number 5, K2 may be an anti-inflammatory agent. Number 6, K2 may be protective for mitochondria. 7, it may protect against neurodegenerative disease. 8, children. Something to note is that children have the highest requirements for K2. There are various reasons for that. I'll submit the paper below, you can read. Because not many things are well studied. With bone health, there seems to be more certainty because there were long-term studies on Japanese population specifically, where different doses of supplemental and dietary forms of MK7 were administered. MK4 also was tested. At pretty adequate, even like attainable doses of K2 among the Japanese population. And the question is, after all of that list, do we even need to be getting a preformed K2? The question remains, right? We need to formulate the task today. Do we even need to consume a preformed K2? In fact, most of the modern population actually does consume less K2 than we're supposed to. So there are two alternative paths, as I mentioned, of possibly obtaining vitamin K2 that are proposed by different outlets that would advocate, for example, as Forks Over Knives, right, in the magazine says that we do not need to track our nutrition and we will get everything we need from just pleasurable, not thought through, but diverse enough plant-based diet that is void of K2, of course. There's no K2 in any normal plant-based diet that doesn't feature natto beans. So 2 alternative approaches to getting vitamin K2. One is bacterial synthesis of K2 in the intestine. This is something, again, very probably appealing to the raw vegan audience because raw vegan diet is the diet that targets microbiome diversity, that targets microbiome development and enrichment. And so it's believed by many, especially extreme raw vegans, that intestinal microbiome, the intestinal bacteria, can produce everything, the full spectrum of essential nutrients for us. So this is hypothesis number 1 that we will look into. And then 2, conversion of K1 into K2 forms inside of the body tissues. So let's look at both of these hypotheses. Hypothesis number 1, bacterial synthesis. The initial proposal that I mentioned in the very beginning of the video, 50% of all K2 comes from the intestinal synthesis, was debunked. And the most relevant consensus on that is that only up to 10% of all K2 is produced by our intestinal microbiome. Thinking of K2 demands, like some essential minimum, I guess, because there is actually no recommended daily dose of K2 that we need to supply, and we will discuss it later in the video. Again, as I mentioned, most of this produced K2 via the bacterial synthesis ends up mostly in the sewage, just as with B12. So for most people, this is not a plausible route of obtaining enough K2, because K2 is, thus produced K2 is produced by bacteria for bacteria. It's locked inside of the bacterial cell membrane, so our body cannot efficiently use it. It cannot efficiently absorb it and cannot efficiently extract it. If we now look into hypothesis number 2, conversion of K1 into K2. This is another good argument that vegans may bring up, because they will say that K1 is indeed converted into MK4 inside of the mammal tissues. And that's true. K1 does get converted into K2 inside of the animal tissues. It's a fact. But let's see. Brain produces most of MK4, and conversion rate of K1 absorbed in the intestine into K2 is highly tissue specific. From the studies on rats, it was found that most K2 in MK4 form accumulates in endocrine organs and salivary glands. We know that there are specific numbers for conversion rate for every organ, but there's no general rule, so they give the range from like 5% to 25%. But thus, synthesized K2 does not play any role in prevention of arterial calcification. So this nutrient virtually does nothing in terms of, like, let's say, prevention of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular disease mortality. And the statement that it does not play any role in prevention of calcification of the blood vessels is pretty strong, because I found two conflicting studies. First study was looking at long-term effects of supplementing with K1 and K2 on cardiovascular disease, and they found that only the preformed K2 resulted in positive outcomes and reduced mortality from cardiovascular disease. With K1, they did not observe any effects like, thus converted K1 presumably did not play any role. At the same time, we will be looking at one of the newer studies that looked into dynamics of K2 and cholesterol. In particular, the study was performed on patients who were taking statins. And statins, because they interfere in certain process shared between coenzyme Q10, vitamin K2 conversion, K1 into K2 conversion, as well as cholesterol formation. Statins prevent formation of K2 from the precursors and thus contribute to the calcification of the blood vessels, which means that if they interfere specifically in the process of synthesis of MK4, then this means that dietary K1 converted into MK4 may be contributing to the calcification of blood vessels. So this is something that I find confusing, and I do not have any answer for that. And another important factor here is that conversion of K1 into K2 happens with participation of cholesterol. And if you notice, the brain being one of the most efficient converters, brain is made up of cholesterol and fatty acids mainly. So we need more than K1 as precursor for conversion. And this is something from the paper. After 10 years of follow-up, the risk of aortic calcification, all-cause mortality, and incident cardiovascular disease was significantly, independently, and negatively correlated with daily dietary intake of K2. However, K1 consumption failed to show any association with any of the end products. So this tells me what? K1, supplemental K1, dietary K1, does not result in the outcomes, in some protective outcomes that we would expect from vitamin K2, from preformed vitamin K2, and that we actually receive. We can prove those effects from either supplemental or dietary preformed K2. So that's something we need to memorize. Another factor that we need to discuss now is bioavailability of key vitamins, and specifically of vitamin K2. Phyloquinone is primarily obtained from green leafy vegetables, in which it is tightly bound to the membranes of plant chloroplasts, and thus less bioavailable compared with phyloquinone obtained from plant oils, and or dietary supplements. And then if we think about the widely advertised whole food plant-based diet, then this diet, yes, nominally contains a ton of nutrients, but practically it contains very few nutrients because we just cannot extract them. We don't have any biological adaptations for extracting those nutrients efficiently. There are some, for example, for some minerals, for example, fermentation of fiber drops pH inside of the intestine, and that facilitates absorption of some minerals. But it doesn't work for just all nutrients, and especially for fat-soluble vitamins, it becomes catastrophic. The efficacy of liberation of K1 in the digestive tract is poor. Menaquinons, which are primarily derived, or K2, that are primarily derived from animal-based sources, are consumed in food matrices containing more fat that may improve absorption and lead to higher bioavailability than phylloquinone. However, this has yet to be systematically tested for all menaquinons. Then from the paper, the absorption rate of vitamin K2 in the small intestine is increased at a higher concentration of bile salt and unsaturated fatty acid. It is known that vitamin K is better absorbed when consumed with fat. Vitamin K2 has a better absorption profile in comparison to K1, which showed a larger inter-individual variation in plasma concentration after ingestion. Further, the absorption profile of vitamin K varies between isoforms. In brief, only 10-15% of vitamin K1 is absorbed by the body, whereas isoform MK7 is more completely absorbed by the body. And now let's look at the transport, storage, and utilization of K vitamins. Unlike the fat-soluble vitamins A and D, vitamin K has no specific plasma carrier protein, but it is transported in plasma mainly by, you guessed it, lipoproteins, and specifically very low density and low density lipoproteins are good old LDL. Following dietary uptake, vitamin K is absorbed in the intestine and enters the circulation via the lymphatic system as a part of the chylomicrons, our good old chylomicrons that scavenge our fat-soluble vitamins and can then transport them across the aqueous membranes. Vitamin K1 is preferentially retained in the liver and rapidly excreted, whereas vitamin K2 acts within the liver and is transported into the circulation. As a result, K2 is available to the whole body, including for reuse in the liver. K2 forms are carried by very low density lipoproteins and LDL, and cellular uptake of K2 is regulated by the LDL receptors. This enables long circulation of some forms of vitamin K2, like MK7 and MK9 specifically, in the bloodstream, making them more usable, making them more bioavailable. And now I would like to read you some parts from the study that was published in 2024. It was studying the relationship between cholesterol and vitamin K2. And the study looked at both synthesis, conversion of K1 into K2, the role of cholesterol in that process, and also in absorption of vitamin K2. So first thing is actually refers to a very well-known process that statins actually promote calcification of the blood vessels. That's why I'm so skeptical about literally all cholesterol-lowering procedures other than regulating, let's say, blood factors that damage blood vessels, such as components that cause oxidation of LDL, something like stress, something like nutritional deficiencies that damage blood vessels. I'm very skeptical about producing keeping some unresolved systemic issue and then lower cholesterol, either through dampening its synthesis through the use of statins or by hindering its absorption by the use of plant oils, plant fats, and copious amounts of fiber. I'm really skeptical about it. So when we look at the conversion of K1 into K2, according to this paper, statins in particular, they suppress formation, this conversion of K1 to K2, or synthesis of MK4 in the organs. It's shown that cholesterol synthesis inhibitors, they prevent formation of MK4. And as you saw, our organs, like glands and brain, they synthesize MK4. So it's something that our organs do need. That's why cholesterol has an invaluable role in those processes. That's why statins, it's another facet why statins are so bad. If we look at the absorption now, we will remember that just as with vitamin D, we do rely on cholesterol, we do rely on the dietary fats for transporting vitamin K2 as well. As a fat-soluble vitamin, the transport and absorption of vitamin K are highly dependent on lipids. Vitamin K shares common cell surface transporters with cholesterol, so interventions aimed at the cholesterol absorption pathway may also interfere with vitamin K levels. Conversely, supplementing vitamin K can also influence lipid levels, as evidenced by the regulation of hyperlipidemia with vitamin K supplementation in polycystic ovarian syndrome patients, which offers a potentially safe dietary solution for treatment of this condition. Although numerous pathological conditions, including osteoporosis, vascular calcification, are characterized by low level of vitamin K, here they refer to vitamin K2, which have led to growing interest in clinical research exploring the possibility of alleviating or preventing these chronic diseases through vitamin K supplementation. So as we can see, interfering with cholesterol absorption through supplying fiber, plant oils, just as we saw with vitamin D, which is also suppression of cholesterol absorption is one of the main selling points of plant-based/vegan diets. It can also reduce absorption of K2. So if you receive it through supplements, but you eat your K2 and then you eat salad, you eat oils, then you also may have the same phenomenon as you see with the vitamin D supplements, that they just fail to work because there are no cofactors necessary for its proper metabolism. So this is something to think about as well. And we discussed in the video on cholesterol, I discussed that even endogenously produced cholesterol, you may still dampen its levels because it's injected, it's recirculated, it's injected into the intestine when you digest food. It gets injected there. But even the internally produced cholesterol, you can still reduce its functionality because of the fiber, because if you also are incapable of producing sufficient amount of bile, if you are not capable of producing good quality bile, then you may also prevent this normal flow of events that enables proper digestion of some very important nutrients such as K2. And again, even conversion of K1 into K2 requires cholesterol. And then, organs that require it, such as brain, for example. Brain produces its own cholesterol pretty well, even though, again, suppression of cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, still results in pretty bad outcomes with neurological and mental health. So there's also something unresearched, something that we are going to learn about when the veil of sin and darkness finally falls off cholesterol. So this is something that I'm excited to see in the future. Now let's look at the study in Japanese women. The most recent study in Japanese postmenopausal women showed that even doses of 350 micrograms of MK7 per week showed a reduced risk of osteoporotic fractures. So 350 micrograms per week corresponds to 50 micrograms per day of vitamin K2. In this study, actually, interestingly, the results of the study were not shown to be true among the European population. Studies on European postmenopausal women showed that MK7 from natto did not aid in bone remodeling. So I have this note here. So how to determine how much K2 do we need per day? Because again, this subject is being studied. There is no recommended daily dose. How do we determine how much do we need? How do we determine how much do we need to strive for? Can we even hit it through some adequate diet? Let's see. Multiple recent studies demonstrated that administering the dose in the range of 30 to 50 micrograms per day of K2 was associated with reduced arterial calcification, which is a major predictor of CVD, so 30 to 50 micrograms per day. Then, second bullet point I have. Supplementation with MK7 did not influence femoral arterial calcification in diabetic patients. I don't know why I have this bullet point here when I should have had it elsewhere. Then, another bullet point. Studies of relationships between coronary heart disease also demonstrated the reduced risk of CHD with daily K2 doses of 35 micrograms. So 30 to 50, 35. So far, if we think about the prevention of or reversal of arterial calcification, the working dose that I found was 30 to 50 micrograms per day, or 35 micrograms per day. So if we average it to be like 40 micrograms per day, of course, depending also on your mass and your size, probably is a working dose. I decided to calculate what would we need to eat per day to get 40 micrograms of K2. So the big issue again is that not all food like most food trackers do not have information on most foods in terms of K2 contents, especially like differentiating which form they come into, like MK4, MK7, 9, 10, 12. They don't have this data, but I found them elsewhere. All foods of animal origin from this list, except for cheese, will have MK4 form of K2, and cheeses, being fermented foods and natto, other fermented food, will have MK7 and some other forms of K2 as well. So this is also important to note here that content of K2 will depend on the origin. Grass-fed animal products are definitely preferred because that's the mechanism through which the animal will be accumulating K2 naturally. Even though, again, supplementation seems to be a normal practice. Supplementation with some derivative of K2 seems to be a normal practice among farmers who raise cattle on grain and like other crappy feed. But the bottom line is that it will vary. But I will be giving you some estimates. So to get 40 micrograms per day of K2, we would need to eat half a teaspoon of natto beans. And again, if we look back at the study of European, I think it was the Norwegian women, supplementation with MK7 from natto beans did not give any positive outcomes in terms of osteoporosis. But half a teaspoon of natto beans, then 50 to 70 grams of Munster, Camembert, aged Gouda, Edam cheese, or 200 grams of cheddar cheese. Then 400 grams of beef liver, and please don't do it. This number is just for general awareness. Don't eat almost a pound of beef liver at a time. It's not a good idea. It exceeds toxicity limit for vitamin A. Then, surprisingly, what I found in the papers, I don't know if this is true, but apparently goose meat, goose liver, are super potent sources of vitamin K2, according to that one paper. So they list that it would take you 9 grams of goose liver pate, or just 110 grams of goose meat to fulfill this 40 micrograms of K2 need. That's kind of strange. I tend to not believe in this, but then from seafood, we have eel. You would need to eat 90 grams of eel to get 40 micrograms. Then you would need to eat just 5 egg yolks. Then you would need to eat 250 grams of butter. I would not be able to do any of that. Then 1 pound of ground beef. This is something I do daily. Then you would need to eat 300 grams of chicken liver, which is also not the best idea, maybe, daily. I mean, I would not be eating liver daily anyway. And then you would need to eat 750 grams of sauerkraut, which would be probably the only food that you would eat that week. And maybe you will reconsider your life choices after that. And then another thing is, from me personally, I assume that animal brains contain a lot of K2 in MK4 form as well. Just thinking about that, again, brain is very greedy producing K2 in this form. So this is something to think about. Also knowing how all animals love to go for brain specifically, not only because it's very calorie dense, but because it contains a lot of fatty acids, a lot of vitamins that are super valuable. Some conclusions here. Number 1, K2 supplements may be inactive. Verify their quality, purity, and origin because K2 is sensitive to UV light, and if extended storage is implied, they also may degrade in the ambient air. Number 2, natto bean supplements did not show success in osteoporosis management in Norwegian women. Were those supplements inactive, or is natto overhyped in general? What I noticed is that Japanese studies, they also use very, very soft wording when it comes to natto. Number 3, consumption of preformed dietary K2 and not K1 reduced incidence of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease mortality. Number 4, preformed K2 and not K1 was shown to reduce the risk of some cancers and type 2 diabetes. Number 5, preformed K2 was shown to be effective in managing polycystic ovarian syndrome and hyperlipidemia. Number 6, fats, cholesterol are required for absorption and transport of K vitamins. Fiber, some plant oils will hinder absorption of K vitamins the same way they do with vitamin D or with vitamin A. Number 7, based on my calculations, based on certain studies, that show how much vitamin K2 is needed to reverse calcification of blood vessels, I derived that we need approximately 40 micrograms of bioavailable preformed K2 per day to see protective and some therapeutic effects. This dose is easy to achieve through normal, widely accessible, and palatable foods. Moreover, through foods that contain the full package of all the synergistic ingredients that help to absorb and assimilate K2. Despite the fact that human tissues can convert K1 into MK4, the fact that supplementation with K2 reverses arterial calcification indicates that it is preferred to consume foods with K2 already present. Unfortunately, you don't need to eat anything crazy to get good amount of K2 that shows therapeutic effects. And fortunately, you don't need to eat any crazy foods imported from across the world, or you don't need to eat a ton of some stuff that you would not normally eat in large amounts. You can eat very approachable and adequate amounts of very approachable and accessible meat and some other animal products per day and get all necessary K2 that comes in like perfectly bioavailable form with all cofactors enabling its absorption, enabling its utilization. So it will be in synergy with all other nutrients. You'll get full package basically. So you will be able to use animal-derived K2 to get all the cardiovascular benefits and bone health benefits. Vegan diet, if we think about vegan diet, is in general an antagonist to all of the fat-soluble vitamins in general, and an antagonist of cholesterol. Not only it can hardly provide any K2, unless again you go eat that natto bean dish that is also arguably usable, but with the disrupted cholesterol absorption, with potentially disrupted cholesterol synthesis, you may not be able to properly utilize even supplemental K2, or if you get the handle on K2 from natto beans. So you need to consider other nutritional factors. Actually, in my video about vitamin A, I mentioned something in passing. Probably most people missed that. The success rate of vitamin A supplementation in impoverished countries is so low. Something between 12 and 24%, which means that it's not the vitamin itself, it's the cofactors, the absence of proper fats to digest, to properly assimilate vitamin A. With vegan diet, the same concern arises. You do not have necessary cofactors to process all of those fat-soluble vitamins that are of such a vital importance for our body. And vegans, yeah, they can be called crunchies, especially the starchivore vegans. Crunchies. Like crackers, because one of the main things is completely degraded bone matrix. That's why it's so important to actually pay attention to fat-soluble vitamins. If you are considering quitting vegan diet and switching to any form of omnivore diet, something you need to pay attention to is actually introduction of as much animal fat as possible, as you can healthily handle. Because again, coming off especially low-fat vegan diets, you likely will have fried gallbladder, you'll probably have fried pancreas, so you would have some period that you would need to ease into consumption of higher doses of animal fat, but this is something that will actually boost your post-vegan recovery, because likely, on top of choline, methionine, B12, you likely are dramatically low on fat-soluble vitamins. And it's not just the pill that will supply you the vitamin, it's mainly the carriers that will deliver this vitamin, the chemicals that will enable proper chemical reactions to make those vitamins work. So vegans, yes, supplementation is always an option, even for non-vegans probably. If you are concerned, if you would like to, if you have a prescription to increase the vitamin K consumption. But vegans have a huge disadvantage that they just run those supplements through them, they end up in the sewage without being used. So that's my conclusion here. Even though the subject is pretty poorly researched, there are some things that are already known and that make it a probably pretty sound and adequate claim that vegans will tend to have poor K2 status. So think about it.